Hi, this is Mr. Curtis, and today what we're going to do is pick up our discussion of the digestive system. Today what we're going to be looking at is the parts of it, or as we call it, the anatomy. Now this is a chart that shows most of the major parts of your digestive system, and when we're finished today, I'll be having you fill in a chart that's similar to this. Rather than go through this all the way from top to bottom, we'll take it in sections. So we'll begin first with the upper digestive system. And we start with these things called the salivary glands, which, of course, is what makes your spit, this wet stuff on the inside of your cheek. What I find interesting is there's this wonderful thing called Pavlov. He was a Russian scientist. He's Russian. He was very smart. And anyway, Russian that he was, what he did is he worked with dogs. And he found out that if you rang a bell, the dogs would begin to slobber before they got fed. So every time he'd ring this bell and feed them, then they would start to slobber. Well, then after a while, he'd ring the bell and they would just start to slobber. So interesting thing about your salivary glands. So that's why when you smell a hamburger burning on the grill, it gets you thinking, it's going to taste good. Well, that's all because of your salivary glands. And, of course, by adding a little juice to what you're eating, it helps the food slide down better as you swallow things. And there's also a little bit of chemical digestion that happens. As I mentioned in the previous video, we talked about this chemical called ptyalin that starts with the breakdown of starches. All right, so we're looking at the sliced view of a person's head. And basically there's several things to point out here. This area here would be the roof of your mouth. That's the hard palate. Over here, that says food bolus. That's just like the chunk of food that you've all chewed up and ready to swallow. Well, how is it that you don't get food that goes down the wrong tube? Well, we've all heard about that, but why doesn't that normally happen? Well, it's this wonderful structure right here called the epiglottis. And what that does is it closes over across your air pipe, so that way you don't accidentally swallow and have food go down the wrong pipe, as they say. Here's the same view, only with the food having gone down a little bit farther. And notice that the soft palate in the back of your throat is closed off too, so that way you don't get any food that goes up and out your nose, or at least that's the idea. Of course, sometimes though, when you get to giggling or things like that, we'll talk about that in a second. Also, this food tube that is going down is called the esophagus, and as we'll mention, there's something interesting about that in a second. Now, every once in a while, that air pipe will open up if you start giggling or if you're talking. Don't talk with your mouth full. You've heard that so many times from your parents. Well, that's because when you talk, you're allowing the air to go through, and then that also means that food can go through as well, and worst comes to worst, you have this happen where you're drinking milk and you have it go all over everybody. And as I mentioned briefly before, the food tube, your esophagus, is actually closed. So it's not an open tube like your trachea, your air pipe. This is a closed tube, and it will only open a little bit as the food is going down. So if this is my picture, a terrible picture of the esophagus, and when you are swallowing something, what happens is it just opens for a little bit and closes, and it just kind of has this cascade motion, something called peristalsis, which we'll maybe talk about later in class. This is why, interestingly enough, you can swallow upside down. So if you've got nothing better to do after school sometime, you might want to try something like this. And again, worst case scenario, you get milk that comes out your nose. Now, once we enter into the stomach, we mentioned before that the stomach is a muscle made out of smooth muscle, and it contracts. It's mostly just a holding tank. Not a heck of a lot of digestion goes on there. Yes, there is some, but not a lot. Also, what's going on, you have a lot of something called hydrochloric acid, HCl, excuse me. Hydrochloric acid, really strong, powerful acids in your stomach, so strong that it can burn a hole in carpeting. And how come it doesn't burn a hole in you? The reason being, you have a chemical buffer, a chemical that coats the inside of your whole stomach, protecting it from getting literally burned up from that acid. We've all thrown up, as gross as that is, and if you remember, it burns a lot of times in the back of your throat after you've thrown up. Well, how come? It's that strong, powerful acid that's in your stomach that's causing that. Also, acid in your stomach, if there's too much of it, and that's what this picture is showing, if you get too much acid, there's a valve at the top of your stomach. It's called the cardiac valve. And it has nothing to do with your heart except for where it's located. As I'll show you in the next picture, your heart comes very close to where your stomach is. They're almost on top of one another. And if you have too much acid in your stomach, it will bother this valve, irritate that valve. The valve will open, and then, of course, you get some acid that sneaks up your esophagus. Well, guess what that causes? Heartburn. When you have acid that sneaks up your esophagus, that causes heartburn. And of course, if you get too much of that, then you can damage your esophagus, and it leads to all kinds of other issues with problems, of course. Okay, so again, the upper part of your digestive system, the trachea, of course, that's your air pipe, lungs. We don't worry about that. That's just for reference. So we have this esophagus, the food tube. Again, I was going to show you where the heart is in relation to everything else. One other thing that is not really a part of digestion, but it separates the upper and lower cavities. That's your diaphragm. And then you have right underneath your diaphragm, your stomach, and then now we're moving into the lower parts of the digestive system. One more thing about the stomach. If you get too much acid, and that can be caused by lifestyle choices, what you're eating, it can also be caused by stress. If you end up and have too much acid for too long, that acid will eat through the buffer and eventually start to eat your stomach, as it shows in these two pictures here. And you can get something called an ulcer. Most ulcers don't actually rupture and break through the stomach. If that happens, then that can be deadly. Most ulcers, they just start to irritate and really cause a sore on the inside of your stomach. You can have one in your stomach, and then this upper section of the small intestine is called a duodenum, so you can have a duodenal ulcer as well. Okay, so after the stomach then, we move on now to the small intestine. The small intestine, that's where most of the digestion happens. The digestion, that's the chemical breaking down of your food into smaller bits, that happens mostly in the small intestine. It is the longest part of your system, up to 23 feet. That's 2 stories. That's almost as long as our whole science classroom. Really, really long, inside every one of you. As I mentioned before, it's where most of the digestion happens, and it produces some chemicals, but most come from the pancreas, which, by the way, also makes insulin. That's for something else. Also, bile from the liver will be deposited into the small intestine. Bile breaks fats down into smaller pieces. It's kind of like a mechanical digestion. And bile also has something else that it does, and I'll leave that for a question in class. Perhaps you can add that to the side of your notes. What else does bile do? All right, so we have this 23-foot section of intestine, and it's coiled up. Well, obviously, by it being coiled up, it doesn't take up as much space. Imagine if it was straight and your whole body was 23 feet long. My goodness, that would be very wasteful. But here, because it's coiled up, you get the same amount of digestion, and yet it's in a relatively small space. Here's the other thing that many people don't realize. By the time all the stuff ends up down here, it basically kind of is like oatmeal with the same consistency, but it's also very watery. It's like watery oatmeal. It's not solid like we think about at the end of things, and it certainly doesn't look like the food that we just ate. It's all mashed up, and a lot of water has been added, a lot of chemicals have been added, and it's very much a watery mixture at this point. Now, in addition, there are these microscopic structures in the small intestines, and they are called villi, little tiny projections. And these projections are small, and the idea is by having them, having all these villi throughout your whole small intestine, you are adding more surface area, which means there's more time to absorb the nutrients that you have digested. It makes your system even that much more efficient. If we took this thing and stretched it all out, it might be this long. This way, you have an extra amount of surface area for you to digest your food. Those are called villi. Now, on to the large intestine. And the large intestine is not the longest. It's about 6 feet long, but it's larger in diameter, and I think that's where its name comes from. There really is not a lot of digestion that happens there. It mostly is the reabsorption of water and some minerals. Now, if the reabsorption is done perfectly, then you end up with a nice, smooth bowel movement. If it's too much water, then of course you get constipation. And if not enough water is taken out, well, then you get the Hershey squirts. So large intestine is very important in terms of, shall we say, the outcome of this whole process. And whatever is not digested is eliminated through a bowel movement. Also, in the large intestine, there are bacteria that grow. And that's natural, perfectly fine. Those bacteria actually will help you in terms of your life, which we can get into more in class. But an interesting thing is, if those bacteria are fed too much, let's say that you eat too much starch or too much sugars. Beans, the musical fruit. Well, beans have a lot of starch. And then, of course, these things then get extra food than they're not accustomed to. Guess what they produce? A lot of gas, which leads to flatulation. My handwriting's a little bad today, so I'm sorry about that. Now, On your sheet, I would like for you to fill out this as best as you can. So here we have several different things. We have this column that is the parts of the digestive system. Here is the process that goes on. Here is the secretions. That's the stuff that's added to the mixture. So for example, in the mouth, saliva is added. And then these are other organs which are associated with those other parts. So for example, in the mouth, you have the salivary glands which produce the saliva which does all those other things. I would like for you to take a few moments, stop the video, fill this out as best as you can. Okay, and then the last thing I want you to do, I would like you to use this diagram to fill in the chart on your sheet as best as possible as well. Yes, I've purposely have left off some of these things. I'm trying to make them not quite as difficult as, let's say, a high school level anatomy class, which all of these parts you would be learning. Once you have this all filled out, then you are finished. And again, make sure that you're adding a summary to the video. And we'll see you next time.